I'm Pastor John Baird, and I want to welcome you to the Way the Word Ministries television ministry. I'm honored, as always, to be here sharing God's Word with each and every one of you. And we are still in our study of the book of John, and this is message number 30 in our study. And today we're going to be in John chapter 7, the first 20 verses. And if you've ever had family problems, well, then you're really going to relate to this message today, because believe it or not, Jesus, he had trouble with his biological family too. Now, when I was growing up, I had a friend who had an older sister who always got her way. And I'll never forget, we were over there spending the night one time, and we were in the living room watching TV, and all of a sudden my friend's older sister, she walked in the room, walked right up to the TV and changed the channel. And man, my friend, he jumped off the couch and he looked at her and he said, "Hey, what gives you the right to come in here and just change the channel like that?" And I'll never forget her answer. She said, "Well, first of all, I'm Mom's favorite. And second of all, Jesus said, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first." Yeah, my friend's big sister, she actually quoted Matthew chapter 19, verse 30, and I'll never forget what my friend said. He just sort of shrugged his shoulders like this, and he said, "Man, I bet Jesus never had an older sister." And he was absolutely right. Jesus never did have an older sister, because Jesus is the firstborn, not only in his biological family, but Jesus is the firstborn over everything. But as we're going to see in our verses today, Jesus did have younger siblings, and they didn't always get along. Now, in the previous chapter, John chapter 6, the one we've been looking at for the past few messages, well, that chapter was a turning point in Jesus' ministry, because that's when all the big crowds sort of stopped following Jesus, and hostility toward Jesus began to rise. And as we're going to see in our verses today, the Jewish religious leaders, they had already began to plot to kill this man that they considered to be a pesky rabbi named Jesus. So let's jump into our verses so you can see what I'm talking about. The book of John, chapter 7, verses 1 through 20. After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea, because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore Jesus told them, "My time is not yet here. For you any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I am not going up to this festival, because my time has not yet fully come." After Jesus said this, he stayed in Galilee. However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. Now at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, "Where is he?" Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, "He is a good man." Others replied, "No, he deceives the people." But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the Jewish religious leaders. Not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught?" Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Jesus continued, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? You are demon-possessed, the crowd answered. Who is trying to kill you? Now, everything that happens here in John chapter 7 takes place over the course of 1 week during the Jewish celebration known as Sukkot, or the Festival of Tabernacles. Of the 3 major feasts of the Jewish people, and there were more than just 3 feasts, but we're talking here about the 3 major feasts, Pentecost, Passover, and Tabernacles. This feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, this was the most joyous celebration for the Jewish people. During the fall season, for 7 days, the Jewish people would build temporary shelters and live inside of those temporary shelters. And these shelters, they would have been made of big tree branches. They would put like 4 big tree branches and put some other tree branches around the top. And then they'd put smaller branches and thatched leaves on top for a roof. And so it was like camping out without the traveling, because they usually set these temporary shelters up right next to their homes. And this celebration, Sukkot, was to remind the Jewish people of the 40 years the people of Israel had wandered in the wilderness. And you'll find this talked about in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 13 through 15, where it says, celebrate the festival of tabernacles for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Be joyful at your festival. Your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. Orthodox Jews in Israel, they still follow this custom, not to mention every year for about the past 30 years, almost 5,000 Christians have attended the Feast of Tabernacles. They go there to show their love for Jerusalem. They even have a roll call of nations during the festival. But let's get back to the Feast of Tabernacles during Jesus' time in our verses. It was supposed to be a time of celebration, like I said, but Jesus turned it into a time of confrontation, so much so that by the end of the week, there's a certain group of people that are going to try to arrest Jesus and kill him. And so as we look at our verses today, as we break this thing down, what we're going to see is that Jesus had to deal with disappointments and disagreements, and that means we will too. And the first thing we need to do is to be prepared for relational disappointments. Now, all of us grew up in some kind of a family, either our biological family or an adopted family, whatever that might look like. But the truth is, whenever you have people living together, there's going to be friction. Sometimes siblings don't get along. Sometimes parents and children don't get along. And even though all that's true, for some reason, there are still some really naive people out there who believe that every family, to be considered a good family, well, they have to be perfect and there can never be any kind of conflict. And when that doesn't happen, those people who think like that, well, they're going to experience some disappointment. There was a Sunday school teacher, and she was trying to teach her children in her class about the 10 Commandments, and she said, well, one of the 10 Commandments, number 5, it says that we should honor our mother and father. And then she asked the class, is there a commandment that tells us how we should treat our brothers and sisters? And this one little boy down in the front row raised his hand and he said, yeah, the very next commandment, commandment number 6, the one that says, thou shalt not murder. And as funny as that is, that's not really far from the truth. The very very first two brothers that we see in Scripture, Cain and Abel, they didn't get along. And Cain, he ended up murdering Abel. Joseph's brothers, they sold him into slavery. And again, you might be surprised to know that there was conflict between Jesus and his siblings. Letter A, Jesus' siblings rejected him. Now, like I said earlier, Jesus was the firstborn of Mary, but the New Testament tells us that Jesus had younger half-brothers and sisters. Look with me at the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, where it says, "When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until after she gave birth to a son, and Joseph gave him the name Jesus." So contrary to some teachings out there, the Bible, it plainly states right there that Mary and Joseph had normal sexual relations after Jesus was born, and they had other children. Those children, they had the same mother as Jesus, Mary, but they had different dads. Jesus is the supernatural Son of God. He's the only begotten Son of God. But those other children, Jesus' younger half-siblings, they were the natural children of Mary and Joseph. And so Jesus was part of a blended family. You can even read Jesus' brothers' names in the book of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, where it says, "People asked, 'Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?' And they took offense at Jesus." In other words, these people here in Jesus' hometown, they figured since they watched Jesus grow up and knew him, at least they thought they knew him well, they figured that gave them the right to put Jesus in their box. They figured that gave them the right to hold Jesus to whatever level their stubborn minds wanted to hold him to. And when Jesus wouldn't compromise with their assessment of him, well, they held him in contempt. And you can circle two of the names in that verse right there, James and Jude, because those two guys ended up believing that their brother Jesus, their half-brother Jesus, was who he said he was, and they each wrote a book in the New Testament that bears their name. Nonetheless, back here in John chapter 7, where we're at today, we can see that at this time, none of Jesus's half-brothers and sisters believed who he was. And so Jesus's siblings' advice to him to go up to Jerusalem for the festival could have come from two different motivations. Number one, maybe they thought brother Jesus had a chance to succeed in Jerusalem politics, so they advised him to go up and launch his public campaign. They said, "Brother Jesus, you need to go up and get on the big stage in J-Town instead of just hanging out here in the backwoods of Galilee." Or number two, they may have just been using sarcasm to say, "Since you're so high and mighty, why don't you go up to Jerusalem and perform some of your magic tricks for them up there? Or are they too sophisticated for you?" One thing that hasn't unfortunately changed over time is that family members will sometimes use words to hurt each other. There was a man who thought his teenage son was being lazy, and so he said to him, "Son, when Abraham Lincoln was your age, he used to chop a rick of wood every day before school." And his son said, "That may be true, Dad, but when Abraham Lincoln was your age, he was president of the United States." And as funny as that is, I find it ironic that Jesus' siblings didn't believe who he was at that time. Verse 5 of our verses says, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." It must have been an absolute heartache for Jesus that his family didn't understand him or believe in him. And maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you're going through something like that right now. It's tough when we're rejected by our own families. It's heartbreaking. And if that's you today, I want you to know that Jesus, he understands everything that you're going through, because letter A, Jesus' siblings rejected him, and letter B, Jesus' hearers hated him. Now, Jesus wasn't being deceptive when he told his half-brothers that he wasn't going up to the festival. He just didn't want to arrive when all the crowds were arriving. So he hung back in Galilee, and then he made the scene at that 7-day festival about halfway through. And as soon as he got there, he started teaching in the temple courts, and some of his listeners, well, they didn't like his message. And so in typical secular humanist style, they attacked the messenger. They hated Jesus for the same reason that the world hates his followers today. Look what Jesus said in verse 7 of our verses. He said, "The world hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil." They hated Jesus because Jesus had the nerve to speak the truth that sinful behavior is evil, and that creates hostility because it causes people to have to look deep inside of themselves. And no one likes to think that their behavior is evil, much less be told that their behavior is evil. And it's really the same thing in our world today. The reason the secular humanist world doesn't mind religion or religious practices is because religion is human-made. And as time goes by, religion always justifies itself to the secular humanist world by compromising with the secular humanist world. But we're not called to compromise with that secular humanist world out there. Listen, when Jesus hung around with sinners, it was the sinners that changed, not Jesus. And so when you and I, when we start to identify ourselves as sinners and we start to call sin what it really is, well, the reaction is always going to be hate. In our nation today, Christians who hold to a biblical view of morality and truth, well, we're labeled as haters. We're labeled as hate groups. The offices of the Southern Poverty Law Center are located in Montgomery, Alabama. It was started way back in the 1970s to help litigate against racial discrimination, but that's not what it is today. Today, it's nothing more than a fake, misguided whistleblower organization that only focuses on their own personal definition of what a hate group is. In other words, anyone who disagrees with their so-called woke ideology is labeled as a hater. And every year they put out a new hate group list, and they get some of them right, like the KKK and the Aryan Brotherhood, but they leave out admitted Marxist groups like BLM and Antifa, not to mention they have wonderful Christian freedom-fighting groups listed on their hate group list. Groups like the Family Research Council and the Alliance Defending Freedom. And again, the reason that those groups are listed as hate groups is because they're Christian groups who define moral values and principles according to the Bible. And the truth is, none of this should really surprise us because Jesus predicted that his followers would be hated. Check it out in the book of John, chapter 15, verses 18 through 19. Jesus said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." So since the world hates us, are we supposed to hate the world back? No. Jesus gave us specific instructions on how we're to react when we're hated. And you'll find those instructions in the book of Luke, chapter 6, verses 22 and 23, where Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven. For in like manner their fathers did the same to the prophet." So Jesus, he faced disappointment not only from his family members, but from some of the people he preached to as well. And that means we're going to face disappointments in life. And when that happens, we don't want to revolt. We don't want to resign. We don't want to seek revenge. According to that verse right there, we need to rejoice because number one, we should be prepared for relational disappointments in life too. And number two, we need to be prepared for doctrinal disagreements. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem in the middle of the festival, it created quite a buzz all around the city. And we're told in verses 11 and 12 of our verses that the Jewish religious leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, "Where is he?" Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. The people were having to discuss Jesus quietly because everyone knew that the Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, well, they had put out the word that they were going to kill this guy who they considered to be a false prophet. And the people, they were obviously divided about Jesus. In verses 12 and 13 of our verses, we read, "Some said he is a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives the people." But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. So Jesus, he was and still is the great divider. And just like those people back there in the first century, people today, they still disagree about three important things when it comes to Jesus. There are three disagreements about Jesus that every person has to answer for themselves. Letter A, people disagree about the authority of Jesus. And to put that in the form of a question, you have to ask, what right does Jesus have to say these things? That's exactly what happened in verses 15 and 16 of our verses, where we read, "The Jews there were amazed and asked, 'How did this man get such learning without having been taught?' Jesus answered them and said, 'My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me.'" Jesus, he didn't teach like the other rabbis. The other rabbis, they were careful to say the Talmud says, or the Torah says, or Rabbi Doodad down the street says. But Jesus, he said over and over again, "Truly, truly, I say to you." Jesus never attended rabbinical school. He never had any human training. Jesus never got a diploma. But by the age of 12, he was already teaching the elders down at the temple. And whenever anyone asked him about it, he claimed to be speaking the words of the one who sent him, his heavenly Father. Look at John chapter 12, verse 49. Jesus said, "For I do not speak on my own, but the Father who sent me commanded me to say all that I have spoken." Every now and then through the years, I've had people come up to me and they say, "God told me to tell you something." And whenever they say that, I always listen politely. And if they read me a Bible verse or a short passage of Scripture, I always think, well, that could be God telling me something. But if they start to tell me things like, "Hey, God told me to tell you you need to preach on the second coming next week," or "God told me to tell you you need to preach on this issue or that issue," well, then I'm extremely skeptical, because my first thought is, why didn't God just tell me himself? Listen, you have to be extremely discerning if someone comes up to you and says, "God told me to tell you something." And if you're one of those people who goes around telling people, "God told me to tell you something," you had better be sure God told you to tell them that. Otherwise, you are 100% a false teacher, and you are profaning God's name in the worst of ways. But when Jesus says, "God told me to tell you something," you better not only listen, you better obey. Every person has to decide for themselves, can I trust the words of Jesus found in the Bible? I believe you can absolutely trust Jesus' words. That's my statement right there on the screen. Jesus, I trust you. That being said, letter A, there are people who will disagree with you about the authority of Jesus. And letter B, people disagree about the character of Jesus. Another question that everyone has to answer is, who is Jesus? Not who is Jesus to you, but who is Jesus according to God's word? Do you believe it or don't you believe it? 2,000 years ago, people disagreed about Jesus' character, and they still do today. Verse 12 of our verses again. Some said he is a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives the people. And by verse 20, we read where some of the people said to Jesus, "You are demon possessed." And you can just hear that argument going on back there in the first century. Some of them were probably saying, saying, he must be good. He healed the paralytic man down there at the pool of Bethesda, and that guy had been laying there for 38 years. And then other ones were saying, no, he's not good at all. He's teaching people to break the Sabbath laws. And so the people were divided over Jesus. What's your answer to the question, who is Jesus? It's impossible for anyone to say that Jesus was simply a good teacher, because Jesus didn't leave us that option. He claimed to be God. And so the question that you really have to answer in your heart, is he God or isn't he? Later in verses 37 and 38 of this chapter, Jesus is going to look at this same crowd and he's going to say, if any person is thirsty, let them come unto me and drink. The person who believes in me will have springs of living water flow out of them. That would be a bold, audacious claim for any simple con man to make back in first century Israel. And so really we only have three options here. Either Jesus claimed to be God and he really wasn't. That would make him not a good man. That would make him a liar. Or Jesus claimed to be God and really thought he was God, but he wasn't. And that wouldn't make him a good man. That would make him a crazy man. Or Jesus claimed to be God and he really was. Again, those are our three options. Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Jesus is the Lord. Letter B. People always have and they always will disagree about the character of Jesus over here on this side of heaven. And letter C. People disagree about the origin of Jesus. This third question, and again, it's one everyone has to answer. Where did Jesus come from? Back in verse 38 of John chapter 6, Jesus made an amazing declaration. He said, for I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And 4 verses later, the people said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I came down from heaven? Later here in John chapter 7, verse 41, those same people are going to say, this man can't be the Messiah. He is from Galilee. How you answer the question, where does Jesus come from? Well, that's going to determine what you believe about the deity of Jesus. Is Jesus God? Do you believe that Jesus has been with God the Father since the beginning of the beginnings as part of the eternal Godhead? Or do you believe Jesus was just a man born of two normal parents? How you answer that question will determine your eternal destiny. And so again, where does Jesus come from? What say you? And so what's the practical application? What's the takeaway truth here? Well, since we live in a culture of relative truth, we have to allow God's truth to shine through us. Now, I'm not one of those ain't it awful preachers, and there are a lot of Christians walking around out there complaining about how hard it is to be a Christian in this pagan culture that we find ourselves in. And in retrospect, in all fairness, our nation was much more accepting of biblical truth 50 or 60 years ago. It was right about that time that they took prayer in the Bible out of our public school systems and began teaching our children intolerance toward our Judeo-Christian roots. But always remember, the world was in much, much worse shape back in Rome under Emperor Nero. And yet those Christians back then, they thrived under that persecution and oppression, and the faith spread like wildfire. And it's always been that way wherever Christians are oppressed and persecuted. And that's why I'm here to tell you right now, we are living in one of the most exciting times to be a Christian, because persecution against us is on the rise. And I think we're about to see some absolutely amazing things happen. And I believe that's why the Apostle Paul told us this in the book of Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. He said, do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. Man, we need to heed those words right there as we continue this truth conversation with our culture. And let's never think that we can argue anyone into heaven. We need to be light without heat and yet still be on fire for Jesus. We need to speak the truth in love, because love without truth is cruelty, and truth without love is nothing but cowardice. We need both truth and love. Listen, God allows us to face adversity in order to conform us to the image of Jesus. And part of that plan involves the painful removal of those things in our lives that don't reflect the character of Jesus. Romans chapter 8 verse 29 says, "For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters." I was on vacation down in the Smoky Mountains, and I came across this old man, and he was displaying all these wood carvings he had made out of blocks of wood. They were wood carvings of wildlife, and I stood there in fascination watching him carve a dog out of this solid block of wood. And I said to him, "How in the world do you do that?" And he smiled, and he probably had answered that question a million times before, but this is what he told me. He said, "I just cut away everything that doesn't look like a dog." And that's exactly what God is doing in our lives. He's cutting away everything that doesn't look like Jesus. In this life, we're going to experience some disappointments, but if we'll trust in God, our greatest disappointment can be turned into a divine appointment. And that's my prayer for all of us in this coming week, that any disappointment we come across for the rest of our lives will be turned into one of God's divine appointments. Until the next time you and I meet here on the Way the Word Ministries television program, may God bless you, may God keep you, and may God grant each and every one of you the desires of your hearts, all in Jesus' mighty name. Until then, I'll see you later, everybody.